Most people assume semi-trucks use bigger versions of the same brakes as cars. They don't. An 80,000-pound truck at highway speed carries roughly 30 times the kinetic energy of a passenger car. Hydraulic brakes cannot reliably dissipate that energy on a long descent. They overheat, the fluid boils, pressure collapses, and then nothing happens when the driver pushes the pedal. Air brakes solve this, but not the way most people think. The compressed air isn't what stops the truck. The compressed air is what keeps the brakes from being permanently locked. Remove the air, and the truck stops whether the driver wants it to or not. That's intentional. The failure direction is the whole story. Every safety-critical system has a preferred failure state, a condition the system defaults to when something goes wrong. For hydraulic brakes, the preferred failure state is released. A hydraulic line ruptures, pressure drops to zero, and the brakes release. The vehicle has no braking force. On a passenger car at 40 miles per hour, that is a serious problem with a survivable window. The driver has seconds to react, engine braking provides partial deceleration, and the vehicle's mass is low enough that controlled deceleration to a stop is possible even without brakes. On an 80,000-pound truck descending a mountain grade at 60 miles per hour, released brakes are not a survivable problem. They are a catastrophic one. Air brakes fail in the opposite direction. The spring brake, the core component of every air brake system on every commercial truck operating in the United States and most of the developed world, uses compressed air not to apply braking force but to hold a heavy spring in the compressed position. That spring is mechanically connected to the brake chamber. When the spring releases, the brakes apply. The spring applies approximately 2,000 pounds of force to the brake chamber when fully extended. Stopping that force requires a continuous supply of compressed air at 90 to 120 pounds per square inch, maintained by the truck's onboard compressor at all times the vehicle is operating. Remove the air from a leak, a compressor failure, or a deliberate driver action at the end of a shift, and the springs extend. The brakes apply. The truck stops. This is the spring brake's design function, not its failure mode. An air brake system with zero air pressure has fully applied brakes. A hydraulic system with zero fluid pressure has no brakes at all. That asymmetry is why federal law requires air brakes on any commercial vehicle above 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. The failure direction of hydraulic brakes at that mass is legally unacceptable. The failure direction of air brakes is a stopped truck. Understanding why hydraulic brakes fail on heavy vehicles requires understanding what brake fade actually is at a physical level, because it is not the same process most drivers assume. Hydraulic brake fluid is a glycol ether compound with a boiling point between 400 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on formulation and moisture contamination. Under sustained heavy braking, descending a mountain grade for several minutes, for example, the rotors and drums accumulate heat faster than it can be dissipated into the surrounding air. That heat transfers through the brake hardware into the caliper or wheel cylinder, and eventually into the fluid itself. When fluid temperature at the caliper exceeds its local boiling point, vapor bubbles form in the line. Vapor is compressible. Fluid is not. The hydraulic pressure the driver applies at the pedal is absorbed by compressing those vapor bubbles rather than transmitting force to the piston. The pedal travels to the floor and nothing happens. This is vapor lock, the specific mechanism behind brake fade on sustained descents. Air is already a gas. It cannot vaporize. There is no equivalent mechanism in an air brake system. The driver can apply and release air brakes continuously on a mountain descent for 30 minutes, and the compressibility of the air medium does not change. What changes is the temperature of the drums and shoes, a separate thermal management problem that air brakes share with hydraulics, but one that does not compromise the pressure transmission physics of the system. Air brakes can fade thermally. They cannot fade hydraulically. That distinction is what made them the mandatory standard for heavy vehicles. The compressor is the system's first component and its only powered one. A belt-driven reciprocating piston compressor, driven directly off the engine, maintains the air tanks at operating pressure continuously while the engine runs. Two tanks are standard, a primary and a secondary, separated by a one-way check valve. If the primary tank develops a leak, the secondary tank maintains pressure to the trailer circuit. If the secondary develops a leak, the primary maintains pressure to the tractor circuit. Both tanks must fail simultaneously before spring brake application becomes automatic. That redundancy architecture does not exist in a hydraulic system at any price point accessible for commercial vehicle installation. The pedal the driver pushes is not mechanically connected to the brakes. This is the second feature of air brake systems that surprises most people encountering the engineering for the first time. In a hydraulic system, the driver's foot is connected through fluid columns to the brake caliper, a direct mechanical linkage mediated by fluid. In an air brake system, the driver's foot operates a treadle valve, a pressure regulator that controls how much compressed air from the tanks is released to the brake chambers. The driver is not generating braking force with their foot. They are modulating a valve that meters stored compressed air to actuators that generate braking force independently. A 250-pound braking input at the pedal of a car produces roughly 2,500 pounds of caliper force through hydraulic mechanical advantage. A 20-pound input at the treadle valve of a semi releases air pressure sufficient to produce 30,000 pounds of braking force at the axles. The driver's foot is a signal source. The stored compressed air is the force source. That separation of signal from force is what allows a single driver to reliably stop 80,000 pounds. Here is what nobody mentions about the air you hear releasing when a truck stops at a light. That sound is not waste. It is information. A driver who understands their system monitors that release, its duration, its volume, its consistency across axles, as a diagnostic signal about system pressure, valve condition, and whether the treadle is releasing fully. A longer than normal release suggests residual pressure in a circuit. A weaker than normal release suggests a restriction. The sound is the system announcing its own status to anyone trained to interpret it. Hydraulic systems are silent. Their failures are equally silent until the pedal meets the floor. The spring brake's continuous air requirement creates a secondary operational reality. A truck parked with no engine running loses air pressure through normal, slow leakage within approximately 2 to 3 hours. When tank pressure drops below approximately 60 pounds per square inch, a low-pressure warning alarm sounds in the cab. Below 40 pounds per square inch, the spring brakes apply automatically regardless of driver input. This sequence is not a failure. It is the system executing its designed response to a low-pressure condition. A driver who ignores the warning and allows pressure to drop while the truck is moving will find the brakes applying without pedal input. The truck stops. On a highway, that is dangerous. But it is less dangerous than the alternative failure mode, no braking at any input, which is what hydraulic failure produces at this mass. The system is designed to be safer to fail than to operate improperly. That principle carries through every component. The service brake and the spring brake are two independent systems sharing the same hardware. The same brake chamber that contains the spring brake assembly also contains the service brake diaphragm, the component that applies braking force when the driver presses the treadle. These are called piggyback or tandem chambers, and the distinction between their functions is more important than their shared housing suggests. The service diaphragm responds to the driver's treadle input, air pressure in, braking force out, proportional to pedal position. The spring brake responds to the absence of air. Spring releases, braking force applies, regardless of pedal position. Both act on the same pushrod. Neither knows the other is there. So this means the truck has two completely independent braking mechanisms at each rear axle position. The service brake stops the truck when the driver chooses. The spring brake stops the truck when the air system fails, when the driver parks, or when the driver deploys it manually via the yellow diamond-shaped valve in the cab, the parking brake control. The two systems cannot simultaneously interfere with each other because their actuation directions are opposite. Service pressure applies the service brake. Air pressure releases the spring. When service pressure is present, it acts against the spring's release force, moderating the combined braking application in what is called a modulating position. The driver using both simultaneously during an emergency receives blended braking from both mechanisms. This architecture has no hydraulic equivalent. The trailer is a separate vehicle with its own air supply, its own spring brakes, and its own brake chambers, connected to the tractor through two lines called the service line and the supply line. The supply line, identified by its red Glad hand coupling, maintains the trailer's air tanks at operating pressure and holds the trailer's spring brakes released during normal operation. The service line, identified by its blue coupling, carries the treadle signal from the driver's foot to the trailer's relay valve, which then applies the trailer brakes in proportion to the driver's input. If the trailer separates from the tractor, a coupling failure, an accident, a deliberate breakaway, the supply line severs. Trailer tank pressure drops instantly. The spring brakes apply. A runaway trailer is mechanically impossible in a functioning air brake system because separation from the tractor automatically stops the trailer. This behavior is called the fail-safe breakaway. It requires no sensor, no controller, no electronic intervention. It is a direct consequence of the spring brake's mechanical logic. No air means brakes applied. Severing the air line is indistinguishable from losing air pressure by any other mechanism. The trailer stops. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations specify maximum brake application timing for commercial vehicles. From pedal input to brake chamber pressurization, the system must respond within specific millisecond thresholds at each axle position. The long supply lines, a standard 53-foot trailer runs brake lines approximately 60 feet from the tractor's treadle valve to the trailer's rear axle chambers, introduce propagation delay that hydraulic systems would manage through direct fluid column connection. Air brake systems compensate through relay valves mounted close to each axle group rather than at the pedal. The relay valve receives a pneumatic signal from the treadle and opens a local air supply directly from the nearby tank to the adjacent chambers. The treadle signal travels 60 feet at the speed of pressure propagation. The braking air travels 18 inches from the relay valve. Response time meets federal specification across the full 53-foot trailer length. Electronic stability control and anti-lock braking on modern tractors modulate the same air circuits through solenoid valves inserted into the brake lines. Valves that can apply and release individual wheel circuits faster than any mechanical treadle input. The underlying pneumatic hardware is identical to a 1960s air brake installation. The electronics are layered on top of it, borrowing its stored pressure and its spring brake architecture while adding the millisecond-level modulation that prevents wheel lockup and jackknife under hard braking. The fundamental physics, spring holds brakes off, air holds spring compressed, treadle modulates service circuit, have not changed since the system was standardized. What changed is the intelligence governing when and how the pressure is released at each individual wheel. Hydraulic brake fluid absorbs moisture over time, lowering its boiling point and increasing vapor lock risk, which is why passenger car brake fluid must be replaced periodically. Compressed air contains moisture that must be purged through an air dryer before it reaches the tanks, because water in the brake lines freezes at temperature, blocks valves, and causes the kind of selective brake failure that is untraceable under normal inspection. The air dryer is the system's most maintenance-sensitive component. A failed dryer passes moisture into the tanks. The moisture accumulates. In winter conditions, a brake valve that worked perfectly in October can freeze in the open or closed position in January. The symptom, inconsistent brake application, slow release or no release at the affected chamber, is subtle until it isn't. The air brake's inverted failure logic, which makes it the mandatory standard for heavy vehicles, requires continuous and specific maintenance to preserve. The system that stops automatically when it fails still fails in ways that are dangerous if the maintenance preconditions are not met. That is the part the failure direction argument leaves out. The spring brake guarantees a stopped truck when the air is gone. It does not guarantee a functioning truck when the air is present, and the system has not been properly maintained. The two conditions are not the same problem. The driver pressing the treadle on a well-maintained air brake system is doing something hydraulics cannot do at this scale, metering stored force through a signal input independently of their own physical strength, with a redundant spring-applied backup that cannot be overridden by any single component failure. The truck stops because the system was designed around the assumption that something will eventually go wrong. It was designed to be right about that assumption before the driver finds out what went wrong. The compressed air is not what stops the truck. It is what gives the driver the option not to.